Welcome to Random Space Story, written by Jake Dunbar and narrated by Gertie McFinish. This is Part 1. The Universe. Many stories, namely the classical fairy tales designed by moral people long ago to instill moral traits in young, immoral children, start with once upon a time. This story will not. This is for two reasons. For a first, this story evades time, so there is no reason to consider it. It was forged when the universe gave birth to time itself, and believe me, it was an incredibly long pregnancy time. A more suiting phrase to start this story would be once upon time itself, or in the beginning, though it seems as though it's a tad too late to change it from many stories at this point. The second reason is that this is not a fairy tale, so please, listener, do not be under any illusions. It is not a story of happy children with smiles bigger than their faces being taught to appreciate the world. If this story was used to instill moral values on children, the next generations would be packed full of raving, blabbering lunatics. It is a story of insanity, love, animosity, sanity, friendship, some more animosity, dictatorship, greed, and probably another segment of insanity. You get the point. Good and bad, but mostly, unfortunately, bad. It was a hot summer. The birds were twittering away and the butterflies were fluttering through warm gales. At least, all of this would have been happening if it was just 13 billion years later. If you were to look out at what was there at that point in time, you'd realise very quickly that you couldn't. For a first, there was no light. Stars had not been born and wouldn't be for quite a damn long time. Secondly, there was nothing to look at. Just an empty field of space. It was incomprehensible, really. How can you imagine such an extent of nothingness? Even space in present day does not do it justice, with all the particles, dust and floaty things just floating about in it. There was nothing. Absolutely nothing. Not even a speck of dust. Thirdly, as a direct result of a dire lack of anything, there was no oxygen, so if by some ludicrous turn of events you had managed to materialise at the start of this known universe, then you'd have a couple of minutes left to live. You'd better start practising to hold your breath. Then, BAM! There was something. Two somethings, actually. Particles whirring around as if they'd only sprung into existence a few seconds ago. This is the point at which scientists of Earth cannot really decide on what happened, but they are all in unified agreement that something happened, or you wouldn't be here right now reading this page. These people are scientists that have dedicated their lives to studying the origins of the universe, but what do they know, nerds? The universe actually started on that would-be summer when the two particles were about to slam into each other at 3 quadrillion times the speed of light, when they kind of came to an abrupt halt, realising the other wasn't so bad after all. They had a little conversation, you know, the regular how's the wife or wonderful weather, before they began to realise their inseparable and undying love for each other that had existed forever. Well, since they had been born a few milliseconds ago. With that, they did what any loving couple would do in their situation, and their situation being that they were the only few pieces of matter in existence, free floating in space, and for some reason they were sentient, and decided to birth a child. After a few seconds, which by all accounts was longer than the universe had existed for prior, the first baby was born, and god damn it was ugly. An amorphous blob of wailing, screaming matter brimmed with the concept of time itself. Years ticked on by, but Mother and Father Particle just couldn't keep up with their enormous monster baby. At a time that likely would have been winter, they decided that enough was enough. Father Particle sprouted arms for some reason, and began to tickle the child. Even though it had no nerves, and by the majority of standards thought up by anyone ever, was not actually alive, it began to squirm. It squirmed and squirmed until it finally squirmed for a last time. All at once, the child was ripped in half by the force of incredible laughter, shattering its nebulous body into a billion shards of baby. They shot around the empty space, finally making it not empty for the first time in existence. Energy from the child poured out into the world, filling filling up the even emptier spaces with the forces of dark matter and dark energy before the concept we know and love as the universe was finally born. Of course, it was a little bit rough around the edges, but given a few billion years, and it flourished. So, long story short, it's likely your scientists can keep fumbling with their tiny brains for the remainder of eternity. I make it another 13 billion years to the next universal reset. Hooray, we're halfway there. And they'd never be able to throw up that story for the life of them. It's not something you can make up, no matter how many reams and reams of inconsequential numbers you can toss into a calculator. If there was a toss numbers into your calculator world championship that ran for the next 10 million years, no answer would be returned. It's simply impossible. You just had to be there. But how, Mr. Omniscient Narrator of unknown origin, do you know that this story is true in comparison to the thousands of other theories just floating around in scientific limbo, I hear you ask? Okay, sorry, just give me a moment. Okay, yes, I have nothing. Look, you'll just have to take my word for it. Stop asking questions because I do not hold all of the answers. All I have is a story that spans quite a damn lot of time, a couple hundred planets, the majority of the universe, and a team of people roped together by something not too dissimilar to the force of destiny. So sit down, grab a glass of water, and don't forget to breathe. Introductions in Realm A57.9. Something always word, beeps, whirs, the whales of modern technology. This was typical of every single trip taken in Dalgos' shoddy scrap heap, as it did exactly what it always did, which he did not know exactly what that was. The joint that fused the sides together moaned under the sheer force. Naturally, he too moaned under the sheer force, not as much as he used to. Dalgos was used to this, the force, many times in the past, and he had manoeuvred a few vomiting actions across the room, but now he was fine with the trips, as most would when it was his 2021st trip in the room. Flashes of purple braced his eyes. He knew he was ready for impact. If he wasn't ready for impact, he was a fool. 2019 times had he crash-landed the vehicle on his trips. Most would take it as a divine sign to tell him to stop driving it, buy a new one, or get an upgrade. However, as he always argued with his own conscience, his brain was tied back by a few ropes of nostalgia. One did not simply discard a ship you had sailed for 2021 trips. It meant a lot to him, like a best friend that was completely inanimate and never talked back to him. That did not stop him from talking to it, however. Come on, you have to make this one, Dalgos growled inspirationally, rubbing the metalwork. He glanced around in hope, riding on the fact that this vehicle had done him proud so many times before. His vehicle was the child of his tinkering brain, a mismatch of intelligent people's life's work, stitched together with an extra flair. Black from roof to floor, with all control panels and steering wheels painted in an eye-watering neon orange. Black. The noise that reverberated endlessly as the ship came to a halt. The whirring stopped. The screaming stopped. As Dalgos picked himself up from his weary position, he cracked his knuckles and rebalanced a pair of black shades upon his nose. Well done, he clapped slowly. I'm not sure you'll have to make it through another one. That's 2022 for the record. Somewhat grottily, he made his way to the exit, whilst giving the vehicle a proud pat on the framework as he passed by the door. Creaking at every hinge, the heavy door to the craft lifted open, revealing to Dalgos the view of the open world outside, a view he was not entirely sure he liked yet. Realm A57.9, he muttered as he energetically disembarked via the steps. Nearly 21% oxygen, breathable. Thank God, that could have been nasty. For a few moments, he took a moment to breathe, take in the view, then glance his eyes across a scanner he had withdrawn from his coat pocket. Colloquially known as Earth. What an imaginative name, Dalgos muttered to himself. That's like Realm X87.76 naming themselves Ice. Very glad they went with Kingdom of Almighty Armageddon Lord. Far more imaginative. Earth. Scoffing to himself, he peered out at the world he had just landed on, in a slight mixture of disbelief and ignorance. The vehicle had been parked rather awkwardly in the centre of a grassy field, surrounded by an urban sprawl of mighty buildings to the east, west, and north. Not to the south, that was just more fields. Pillars formed from the minds of architects and shaped into reality by hundreds of workers, moulding endless amounts of materials, shot up into the sky, almost as if they were attempting to support it. If the columns of glass and stone were absent, the cloud would have nothing left to rest on. Instantly, as he glared out, his ears were struck by a sensation worse than the whirring of his arrival. 10,000 metal beasts with legs of rubber, honking as they prevailed down concrete streets. The beasts were of all sizes: massive rectangular trucks, squarish cars, wiry bicycles armed with a pilot on the top. Brushing a delicate tear from his eye, he realised that it reminded him of home. Home, a sprawling community where everyone went about their work with the goal of making their mark in life. Not what he had now, not what he had been reduced to. This was not the life he wanted to live, but life did not care what his aspirations were. To make his way through the cold tunnels of existence was all he was damned to remain in doing, hoping that one day he would reach greatness. It was far off. Wiping his face, he finally entirely disembarked the craft and entered into the field, revelling as the tiny blades of green tickled the gap between his trousers and his boots. Here, the air was fresh, much fresher than the likes of X87.76 or even, God forbid, V65.2. Whenever he thought of that realm, he had to massage his temples to remove the pain. What a horrific experience that place had been. Nevertheless, quite content in the moment, Dalgos merrily made his way through the field, jumped the fence at the end, ignoring the gate around a metre to his left, and entered into yet another field. Yes, he was going south. Often he found the best places that defined a realm were not in its packed civilian capitals, but in its suburban stretches, the locations where the real people lived, not the busy, ignorant city-goers. After the fields, the grass started to transition into a fine mulch, covered by a canopy of thick woodland trees, mostly deciduous oaks, Dalgos' scanner told him. Never before had he heard of a deciduous oak, though his employment often taught him wacky and wonderful facts about the universe. Kicking the leaves up with his boots, he became quite excited as he experienced this new world for the first time. It was diverse, to say the least. On one occasion, a shy, redential creature with a flowing tail embarked on a journey down from its tree. After its legs and arms had been worked tirelessly across many branches, it finally came to a perch upon a log on the floor. Captivated in awe, Dalgos watched, his jaw inches from the floor, as the furry animal munched on a fallen nut. The furious incisors pounded down with no restraint, grinding the core into a pulp that was easily swallowable. "Amazing," he exclaimed, awestruck. "I've never seen such an amazing creature." Evidently puzzled, a passing-by woman approached Dalgos, confused by his excitement. "It's a squirrel," she inputted, at least hopeful that her naming of the animal would help this foreign traveller. "A squirrel!" he exclaimed. "Brilliant! I've never seen one of those before." With his right hand, he withdrew the scanner again, passed it over the chewing rodent, and read through the page. "Are you not from round here?" she asked, logically, still rather bewildered by the 30-year-old man who was nearly hyperventilating over a squirrel. "It's not just a squirrel," he muttered, mostly ignoring the woman. "It's how it all works together. The deciduous oak, the squirrel, the insects, the human, all part of a wider ecosystem. It's fantastic. In all the realms I've been to, I've never seen anything as complexly refined as this. Have you ever seen anything like it? Well, of course you have, you live here." "Are you high?" she retorted, watching the adult marvel over the basics of the world. To this, Dalgos raised an eyebrow. "High?" He glanced at the scanner for a moment. "We're around 7 meters above sea level right now, so relatively no." "Drunk?" she snapped, trying to walk away. It was no use, for he followed her along the track. "Drunk? I had a litre of dihydrogen monoxide before I left for this realm, so yes." "What?" she snapped again. Can you just leave now?" As her legs began to pick up a pace, Dalgos, unaware of simple social respect, continued to follow her. Both people picked up their pace, with Dalgos struggling to tail her. "Hey, you know a lot about this place, right? Can you teach me, please?" Dalgos asked politely as his muscles began to burn, namely his legs. As she turned round to consider his offer, he withdrew a tiny pendant from his trench coat pocket, rolled his fingers over it in his hand, then displayed it so that her eyes could be locked in wonder upon it. In the flow of the wind and under the might of the radiant sun, it glistened. Solid gold, it would have seemed, glittery perfection bundled into a pristine package. With a shaky hand, she reached out, accepting the invaluable pendant. "You can take that, I just need to know some things about this realm." Warily, there was a blank look that Dalgos seemed to absorb from the face of the young woman. Utter bewilderment, as if he had been talking nonsense. Not nonsense, science. Science tied together with a little pinch of randomness, sprinkled with a fine dust of misunderstanding. It was, in essence, why Dalgos was here. Before she could accept the pendant, she gestured for him to wait, which he did obediently, shouted, "I'm just going to check something," then sprinted over to the opposite side of the park. There, with her muscles now burning, she reached her partner, who was, aptly, pushing a pushchair across the dehydrated mud. The wheels grinded against the solid ground, and he provided a confused, appropriately blank look as his partner came sprinting back to him. "What's up?" he interjected, worried, though calm. Breathless, she tried to speak. "Crazy man, in park, not talking to him alone. You are coming." Furiously, she tugged him by the arm, leaving him no choice but to follow. Dragging the pushchair behind them, the two traversed back through the woods until they returned to Dalgos, who was, once more, admiring the beauty of a random squirrel. "I'm Kara, this is Steve," she introduced. "This is our baby Arya, and we are going to get you some help." "That's brilliant," proclaimed Dalgos, grinning. "I'm Arcus Dalgos of the realm U76.623, and your help will be gratefully accepted in navigating this new world." In return, the stranger deposited the pendant in Kara's hand. "He's definitely crazy," uttered Steve to himself, to which Kara smiled adequately. Kara led the way, for she knew this forest with Dalgos, Steve and Arya, albeit too young to walk, let alone make a decision of where she wanted to walk, trailing behind her, the latter too slightly worried for their well-being. Strangely, Dalgos did not appear daunted by this new world. In fact, he strode quite confidently, a bounce in his step, staring in amazement at the world around him. Butterflies fluttering like fairies in the wind, tree stumps wound around the ground like climbing hands. Leaves floating gracefully through the air, the forest was alive with folk, both human and animal. Underfoot, the organic litter crunched and crumpled with satisfactory noises to the ears, which Dalgos bathed in. Perfect crunches of oranges and browns, setting his ears alight with passion. Dalgos had seldom experienced anything like it. The forests of Realm H87.5 were somewhat similar, though the bark was hot pink and the leaves a crispy crimson. But overall, it was the wildlife that fascinated him. Most realms that he had journeyed to in the past only had a few native species, the most being 43, though he could tell that Earth, with all the imagination that went into its name, was home to far more than that. "So, first question," Dalgos inputted as they navigated the forest. "How old is this particular planet?" 4.5 billion years old, suggested Steve, teeth half gritted as he steered the pushchair over a patch of jagged rocks. "And how old are you?" Dalgos followed up, aiming the question at Kara. 24, she replied, confused as to why this mattered. "Wow," Dalgos reamed sarcastically. "That's pitiful. You've only been alive for 5.33333333333, and so on, times 10 to the negative 9 of your planet's existence. Pitiful." "Why, how old are you?" retorted Kara, still confused as to whether to continue conversing with the insane man before her. 1,746 years old. Immediately, Steve pulled Kara to the side. Both members of the couple were stained with sweat across their foreheads and torsos, as they were becoming increasingly alarmed by the mental state of the man. When Steve lifted his hand to accompany his speech, it shook violently from side to side. "What are we going to do?" he whispered, concerned. "I say we keep talking to him, lead him out of the city, then call the police, take him back to Wackoland." Both individuals nodded at each other, then continued on their way down the forested path, with Dalgos trailing behind them. Only there still remained one issue. Dalgos had actually heard the entire conversation and was rather disgruntled that his couple was yet to believe him. He had spoken the truth, and only the truth. The city, Wacko-land, he didn't want to be held against his will. He was a free man. What would they do to him if he was to be captured? Torture by squirrel? Wrath by deciduous oak? He did not want to wait to discover the possibilities, so began to scheme a more apt plan. "Would you like to see my vehicle?" he asked politely from behind, much to the confusion of even the 1-year-old child. She frowned at him with her obscure brow, and Kara mimicked this. "Vehicle?" she retorted aloud, then returned and whispered to Steve, "This man needs desperate help." Affirmatively, both men nodded. With no more questions asked, Dalgos instead led them back through the forest that they had just traversed, dodging vines and deciduous oak branches until they emerged upon a clearing. For meters and meters there resided rolls of green upon green, until it met with the base of the mighty city. With roots of concrete, the skyscrapers of the horizon shot up to the clouds once more, dominating the skyline with their stone branches. Fractals of sunlight were rendered useless by the grand glistening windows of these trunks, which could, with a slight possibility, blind a person who stared upon them too long. Rubbing his strained eyes, Dalgos trekked across the field again. In the centre, just where he had left it, was parked his vehicle, a neat, single-room device about the size of a generous car, maybe a Land Rover. And a beauty of a piece it was, fashioned with the latest technology from across the realms, albeit most of them were from different owners originally, and towering as tall as ever. The paintwork was a pristine condition for a craft that had been made 2022 voyages ago. No scruffs, no cracks, no mud. Even Dalgos, whilst he stood there in amazement at his own property, was wide-eyed and jaw-dropped at the fact that it had sustained no damage from the rocky landing. A minor instability where the landing gears had kicked in, but nothing more. Perfection. His perfection. "Want to see how it works?" he questioned excitedly, buzzing up and down. "See how it works?" Kara scoffed upon seeing it. "If that thing does anything, I'll definitely be surprised." Locked in a visual war, she stared down the heap of metal that stood before her. It looked like someone had made a patchwork quilt of vehicle parts, just like her grandma used to make. Even the windscreen at the front, which she could assume should be one of the safest parts, was made up of the glass of 3 separate vehicles, welded together with a stream of plastic. Every single inch of the paintwork was riddled with chips and dents, as if some unruly fellow had smacked it 1,000 times over with an iron mallet. Because of this, its stature was misshapen. It leaned slightly to the left, creaking on the few hinges that stabilised it. In colour, too, it was congruently an eyesore, matte black with burning stripes of neon orange that tickled her vision. A scrap heap. His scrap heap. "You comin'?" Dalgos reaffirmed as the 2 human adults alongside their child gawked in disbelief at the vehicle. "No, definitely not," stated Kara, shaking her head. "Sure," stated Steve, actively wheeling the pushchair up the ramp to the craft and disappearing under the doorway. "Steve!" she yelled in reaction, tailing him up the ramp. A creased brow, her eyes were devoured with fury. How could he board the random vehicle of some random insane man with their only child? It was madness. He was being so irresponsible, she thought. On the one hand, there stood the notion that this man was making up his own life as he went along, crafting ludicrous parts to lure them in and kill them. On the other, she considered that maybe, just maybe, there was an element of truth to what he said, though this was a rather tiny hand. "Fine," she growled reluctantly, chasing them up the ramp further. As she stomped, the ramp groaned, having succumbed to a brutal landing, a pushchair, and an angry woman, all in one day. Once inside the cramped craft, Kara got a thorough look around. One simple room with crates and boxes piled high to the ceiling. There were 6 seats, no seatbelts, and one lonely lamp that flickered in the centre. In front of the 6 passenger seats, there sat a single pilot seat, armed with all the technology needed to utilise it, which also contained a crystalline blue screen. The screen possessed many different options, which she assumed were used to pilot the machine. For a moment, she paused in continued disbelief, bewildered that it appeared the craft actually did do something. "Does it work?" Of course it works, Dalgos replied, sitting comfortably in the pilot's seat. With his right hand, he altered the position of various levers. With his left hand, he quickly navigated the user interface of the screen and selected an option that his eyes favoured. Suddenly, the ship jolted. Kara tightly gripped onto a metal structural support, then decided it would be best to sit down. Steve did the same, keeping Aya close behind him. After the gigantic jolt had halted, the ramp heaved itself up to seal the door, the light flickered with a more intense brightness, and the engine at the rear flared up with a roar. Sparks poured across the base of the craft. Bolts of noise fractured across the room as metal screamed and hinges wailed. In an instant, the craft was gone. Poof, and away they went.